Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for inviting me to the Popper seminar, and even more importantly, to your Christmas lunch, which was fantastic. I have my hat here, which is now kind of doubling as a pocket handkerchief. And the exciting thing about doing this talk after Christmas lunch is that I'm sort of hoping that you've all had some wine and champagne beforehand. So, so all your questions hopefully will be, inchoate and jolly and easy for me to deal with now. So I'm this could be called Puzzles for Act-Utilitarianism as well as Longtermism, but I'm trying to focus on the connection between the two views. So just as a kind of backup, I'm sure lots of people know this, right? So what is long-termism? So long-termism grew out of the effective altruism movement, which starts with a thought that seems very compelling, I think, to a lot of people, that we would like to make the world a better place and a happier place, and if we were going to do that, we should direct our efforts to do it effectively, right? So that seems like a very compelling thought. The funny thing is that the logic of kind of utilitarian maximization that is part of this movement has led effective altruists to some quite strange conclusions. For example, famously, effective altruist organizations have said, oh, you want to make the world a better place. It's true that the best outcomes that you could bring about might involve political reform, but it's so unlikely that's going to happen that it would be maybe a better idea to make lots of money and donate it to highly effective charities. And so I have another paper which is sort of worried about that issue, but this is about an outgrowth of effective altruism, long-termism, which again starts with a very compelling idea. We should care about the long term, and we should not treat the interests of future people as being somehow less significant than those of current people. But again, long-termists end up with this thought coming to some quite strange conclusions, that they should focus more on questions like of existential risk, or about the AI singularity or colonizing other planets, than things like poverty alleviation, which are kind of merely about the world today. So I don't like these conclusions, and I'm interested in diagnosing where these sort of seemingly appealing starting points go wrong, and this is part of that kind of overall project that I'm interested in. So just to be clear, not all long-termists or effective altruists are act-utilitarians. But, as I just said, act-utilitarianism is the intellectual wellspring of both movements. And it's one of the most straightforward justifications for some of the more surprising, to some shocking conclusions that these movements have drawn. And indeed, where effective altruists and long-termists depart from strict act-utilitarianism, they often do so by doing things like applying side constraints about rights or justice, saying, well, we should maximize utility as long as we kind of respect these constraints. And on these views, the core of that view still remains act-utilitarian in structure. The kind of view about what you ought to do, like in the part of, say, planning that involves trying to make the world a better place, there's still this act-utilitarian component. And what I'm going to talk about now, I'm going to kind of focus on any theory which has this central component, whether or not it has these side constraints, because they're not really going to be relevant to what I want to say. So what explains the connection between act-utilitarian thought and long-termism? So long-termism starts, I just mentioned, with the observation, well, I didn't mention, sorry, starts with the observation that the number of people and other sentient beings who will live throughout the duration of the extended future utterly dwarfs the number of those who are alive today and in the near and medium-term future. So long, that is, as we don't sort of do something that wipes out all life. Moreover, it does seem compelling, I think, to say that, on some level, the interests and welfare of those who live in the far future are just as intrinsically significant. They have as much value, they're as important as the interests of those who live today. Just as you might think, the interests of people who are physically distant from us are just as important as the interests of people who are physically close to us, and they say the same thing about temporal distance. And again, there's something quite compelling about that thought. But none of this implies anything about what people ought to do. So in order to get that kind of conclusion, right, this is where I think the distinctive contribution of act-utilitarianism. It's so hard working on this topic. Act-utilitarianism. I have a student who just like cannot say the word, who's writing on it, and in every supervision, it's just this sort of like, I can't say it. This is the distinctive act-utilitarian contribution, because act-utilitarianism says, on the one hand, you might, what I've just tried to argue for, to present the view is, this notion you might call it axiological temporal impartiality, that the value of someone's interest isn't affected by distance. And act-utilitarianism thinks that there's a kind of an incredibly tight relationship between what matters and what reasons agents have. I sometimes call this the isomorphism of reasons and values. So it says that the fact about these numbers of people in the far future generates reasons of exactly the same strength. So just as we have in these people's lives, their interests are equally important, so we have exactly equally strong reasons to help people in the far future as those who live today, if we can, to the extent that we can affect their lives and welfare. So, the thought is then, because these people's interests generate reasons just as strongly as current people, there's no kind of sense in which that there's less reason to help their interests. The fact of the numbers then generates the conclusion that our reasons to help other people in the future sort of massively outweigh reasons to help people today, because there are so many more of them, right? Another feature of this view, which I should just say now, is that reasons are supposed to be agent neutral. So any agent who is capable of having an effect has exactly the same form of moral reasons, given their ability to alter things. So the result is everyone has equally strong reasons to promote the interests of people way in the future, to the extent that we can do that. And if we can affect the interests of people far in the future, that kind of outweighs the reasons we have to affect those living today. So that's sort of the view. So how, on an act-utilitarian view, do values generate reasons? So one way of understanding this is that the kind of function from values to reasons roughly tracks the structure of orthodox decision theory. But it's worth saying two things. So one, I'm not saying that act-utilitarians think that we ought to deliberate in act-utilitarian terms. They're not actually proposing a usable decision theory for agents, right? Because there are arguments that this is not actually a good way for people to deliberate. So I kind of take Peter Railton's line that this is not a claim about how to deliberate, it's a claim about our objective moral reasons. So it's a claim about, in virtue of what it is the case that we've done what we have most reason to do, or what's right. So it's not like we should always be thinking about this, or in these terms we should always be trying to do this, but in evaluating whether we've done what we have most reason to do, what's correct, this is a view about that. Whether or not it's useful to deliberate in this way, this fact fixes whether we've done what's right and what we have most reason to do. And for that reason, it's important to remember so this fact about the fact that we have objective moral reasons that are impartial at the time, that fact is not contingent on circumstance. The fact about how values give us reasons isn't contingent on circumstance. And it's important to remind you of that, because one feature of utilitarianism that many people find very appealing is its flexibility, its adaptability. It tells us to behave in the world as we find it, and not in some idealized world where things are better. And so this implies flexibility at the level of act types. So a particular kind of act, like murdering someone, might normally be wrong, but in the right circumstance where it can create the right outcomes, it could be right. A particular form of decision-making might be a really good way to deliberate for people in one context. It might be a bad way to deliberate in another context, just depending on the contingent circumstances. Maybe we should use different heuristics when we're in different contexts. But this general fact about what we objectively have most reason to do isn't contingent on circumstance. this kind of fixed function from like agent-centered world, possible worlds that we can affect to what we have reason to do. And so that it clarifies the thought. So some people are attracted to the idea that sometimes when we're making decisions that affect the far future, we should apply a discount rate. So we should sort of weigh those less strongly. But that's actually not a claim about what objective reasons we have. It's not saying that future interests, we discount the strength of the reasons. It's not that they matter less. It's just in deliberating, we're going to do a better job of approximating what we objectively ought to do by applying the discount rate, perhaps because of uncertainty, which might grow as we go into the future. Right? So these modifications to our theory of decision-making aren't supposed to be modifications to the theory of what we have objective reasons to do. And this is important because the reason that we might alter our decision theory is precisely to track these this fixed fact about what our reasons are, which isn't sort of contingent. Okay, so that's sort of the setup. And what I'm going to argue now is that while it might look really appealing if you want to have these long-termist conclusions to adopt act-utilitarianism, at least as a core of your view, this marriage isn't a happy one. Rather than offering the best justification for long-termist conclusions, in fact, act-utilitarianism faces I think, insuperable paradoxes when thinking about the long term for any kind of theory of this kind. So I illustrate this with a story that I call Jam Tomorrow, which is it's not about jazz, sadly. It's inspired by Lewis Carroll. Jam tomorrow, well, I'm not interested in jam yesterday. Jam tomorrow, but never jam today. And this is the story that I'm going to tell. So it's the year 2030. And after the near misses of the second Trump administration, the nuclear standoff with Russia, the SpaceX catastrophe, the anthropic alignment scare, the tide in policy circles has swung decisively in favor of long-termist thinking. So no longer confined to academia and sort of exhorting from institutes that policymakers should do better, or having to just bend the ear of a few sympathetic tech billionaires, long-termists have found a place at the center of the American government with the establishment for the Department for Long-Term Planning. And moreover, the department's independence and funding have been irrevocably secured by a constitutional amendment, freeing staff members from oversight by elected politicians who might otherwise be able to fire them. Within the Department for Long-Term Planning, there are various units, so some dealing with existential risk, others with AI alignment, or popular topics amongst long-termists, pandemic preparedness, and so on. Sam was a staff member at the Department for Long-Term Planning, working in the energy planning unit. Because while AI researchers were constantly innovating new socially valuable uses for large language model-based technologies, these required massive quantities of energy. The energy planning unit, the EPU, had recently placed an order for 10th generation solar panels for a vast new solar farm that would provide energy for some of these potentially socially useful AI innovations. And these solar panels would be ready for delivery in 1 year and would last 10 years before they would need to be replaced. However, Sam's colleague Sasha pointed out to him that researchers in Cambridge had recently made a breakthrough in solar panel optimization. Generation 11 panels would be significantly more efficient and last 11 years before needing to be replaced. And although the EPU had made a down payment on the Gen 10 panels, the constant decline in the price of solar panels meant that with the remaining funds, they could afford to get the same number of Gen 11 panels. The only downside was that they would take 1 extra year to deliver. So they'd be ready in 2 years rather than 1. But never one for sunk cost thinking, Sam concluded that he ought to change his order. The services provided by the farm would be beneficial, but they weren't urgent. And the interests of those living 2 to 13 years in the future were no more important than those living next year. So he ordered the switch. A few months later, Sasha came to Sam with more exciting news. a spin-off from MIT, had made a further breakthrough. Generation 12 panels would last 12 years each and would be cheaper and even more efficient than Generation 11 panels. But they wouldn't be ready until 3 years hence. Still, consistency compelled Sam to order the switch. Why accept a smaller benefit in 2 years when something better could be had in 3 years for the same price? It was another few months later that Sasha came to Sam with even more good news. A further breakthrough from a Chinese manufacturer would provide Generation 12 panels with a novel built-in energy storage function, allowing the plant to supply clean energy even when the sun wasn't shining, for a lower cost than the EPU's original supplier. Now, the problem, which I'm sure has struck you, struck Sam and Sasha at the same time. The march of technology wasn't going to slow anytime soon. Indeed, it seemed a safer bet that it might even accelerate. And these extra projects weren't urgent. They were beneficial, but not. And Generation 12 panels would soon be replaced by Generation 13 panels. Energy storage would continue to improve. One day, maybe even a whole new branch of technologies would make these obsolete. Freed from short-term thinking, Sam and the rest of the EPU at the Department for Long-Term Planning, and all those who came after them in the department, would always be faced with new opportunities to forfeit present and near-term smaller gains for greater long-term benefits. But when would it ever end? Would rational planners like Sam and Sasha ever have a good reason not to defer gratification? Peering into the depths of the limitless future, wouldn't it always make sense for temporally impartial planners who are altruistic to continue sacrificing near-term benefits for longer-term benefits, which, given the inescapable march of technology, it seems like it might always be a possibility? But if no one was ever going to cash in on the investment, then what was the point? If deferred gratification would always be rational, and if planners always did what was rationally required, then no one would ever get any gratification. But in that case, why bother deferring? So why have they got here? So Sam and Sasha, as I presented them, are thinking like temporally impartial act-utilitarians. They're giving no greater weight to the present and near term than they do to the further long term. And they're able to devote their resources accordingly. In fact, actually, nothing in this story hinges on how they're actually thinking, right? It's actually just a question of what they end up doing, whatever decision procedure they might be using in the department. So it's not about, this is not an argument about like decision guides. All that matters is what they do. And so, how do they get to this problem? It arises from three further facts. So one fact is that their work will be continued in the future by other long-termists who are just as sort of objectively morally rational or do what's objectively moral right just like they do. So the second condition is that there will continue in the future to be opportunities indefinitely to trade short-term gratification for greater benefits down the line. And three, the future of those benefited is of sort of indefinite duration. Right? So this can carry on. So together, these assumptions generate the conclusion that no one's ever going to enjoy the benefits for which their antecedents were sacrificing, because it's always going to be rational to defer. But this isn't just sort of morally regrettable, it's paradoxical, right? It's contradictory, because if no one ever benefits, no one's ever going to cash in, then the utility of deferring is zero. You gain nothing when you lose something. So this is the first version of the jam tomorrow paradox, as I call it. So it has sort of, you can formalize it with three premises. So first, it's sort of morally rational to make a deferring trade-off in which we sacrifice the option of a lesser present benefit for the option of attaining a greater future benefit. Two, if it's rational to make a deferring trade-off in any individual case, then it's rational to make every trade-off, which is a member of an indefinite series of such trade-offs. And the third claim is if deferring trade-off is a member of this endless series, then its expected gain, or its gain, in fact, is negative. So it's not rational. So, if our tomorrows are endless, if the production of jam always continues to improve, and if choices are made by rational planners, then the consumption of jam will always be deferred until tomorrow. But that's pointless, because you can't eat jam that will only ever appear tomorrow. So I just want to defend each of these claims. So the third claim that if it's a member of a series and you always defer gratification, the gain is zero, and therefore it's like wrong. I think that doesn't need much justification. I think that just follows from a kind of general utilitarian thought that what we're trying to do is to increase utility and have good outcomes. So I don't think I need to defend that any further. So the second claim, saying if it's rational in one instance, it's rational in every instance of the series. You might think, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe a trade-off it's a member of a finite series is a fundamentally different kind of thing from a trade-off that's a member of an infinite or indefinite or bounded series. But you might think, well, look, that can't be right because of the third claim, right, which is that this leads to no utility. And of course, there must be something wrong here, right? So we're kind of trying to look for what's wrong. But just as stated, the kind of view, it's a fundamentally different kind of thing for the purposes of evaluation seems to me to be worryingly ad hoc, right? I mean, I think we sort of normally accept that the very same function that could produce a finite series can produce an infinite series. So, like numerically, the successor function can produce a finite series. It can also produce an infinite series. But we don't say it's like a different function when it's used to produce an infinite series, right? So it seems weird to think it's a fundamentally different choice when it's just followed by further iterations of the same choice. So that seems like a strange view to me. Furthermore, just thinking like specifically about a standard for action, right? There's no point at which a finite series becomes an infinite series. Right? This is kind of why I said indefinite, right? Because it's not like it is infinite now, it's continued indefinitely. There's no point when it goes from being finite to indefinite. So there couldn't be an action guiding principle that told you make deferring trade-offs in a finite series, but stop when it's an infinite series, because that change never happens. Right? There's no fact of the matter, I think, about when that change is occurring. So if that's not the problem, maybe the problem is that in premise one, I spoke about options, right? I said, the option of a smaller present benefit for a greater long-term benefit. So you might think, look, I don't care about options. What I care about is realized utilities. And if an option never gets realized, you never cash in, then that's not kind of interesting to me. I don't care about that. Well, I mean, yes, that's sort of true to an extent. There's no point trading a benefit for the option of a greater benefit if I know that it's not going to be taken because of some external force or because of like irrationality by whoever's making the decision tomorrow, be it me or another person. But the story that I just told you is nothing like that at all, right? Sam and Sasha are rational planners and their future counterparts are rational planners. And the only reason that they're failing to cash in on their option is to trade an option for an even better option, right? So it's hard to see how a utilitarian can find anything to complain of in that. I don't think we can find any plausible principle that says that present utilities can't be traded for future options for greater utilities only if there is some specific point in the future at which it's cashed in. Like that, there's no like way of saying no, only if you cash in tomorrow, because like, how could it be bad in a sense to one thing is I could I could trade a small amount of jam for like greater jam tomorrow, or I can trade a smaller amount of jam for either greater jam, or you could swap it for even greater jam. So I'm just adding an option, right? And I know that the people who are making choices are like morally rationally perfect. So how could adding an option make things worse? So maybe you think the problem with Sam and Sasha and their future counterparts is that they're maximizing act-utilitarians, and maybe if they had some like satisficing principle, then they could avoid this, according to which you only have to pick a good enough option. I don't think that can be true either, because that doesn't help. Satisficing views don't say it's wrong to do the best thing. They just say that you're not always required to. but it'd still be good to produce better outcomes. It's always good to trade less for more. So, even if that satisfies us, no one would be doing anything bad and no one would be doing anything wrong if they continued doing this. What we'd need to do to prevent a Jam Tomorrow series would be a principle that demands someone to refuse to defer gratification, even though each individual case of deferral includes trading less for more. And I don't see how an agent-neutral theory like act-utilitarianism, which has exactly the same structure of reasons applies to every agent, could possibly give you that result, because every agent is sort of analogously placed. And if you were talking about like a useful way of making decisions, maybe you could build in something like that. But that's not what this is about. This is supposed to be a claim about objective moral reasons. And given that they're otherwise like identically situated, it's hard to see how this kind of theory could ever give you that kind of outcome. Still, you might think this is kind of basically a very unimportant problem, because look, these conditions that I told you are pretty sort of outre possibilities. They're quite unlikely to occur, so maybe we don't have to care, right? As soon as any of these things fails to obtain, the paradox dissolves. As soon as any of Sam and Sasha's future counterparts, aren't kind of rational long-term planners, or as soon as the march of technology slows or stops, or it sort of becomes true that actually the future of sentient life is going to end at a certain point, then at that stage it becomes rational to cease deferring and to cash in and enjoy the jam now. And you might think, look, given the likelihood that one of these things obtains, Sam and Sasha sort of aren't always, and their future counterparts aren't always rationalized, subjectively at least, in continuing to defer, because someone somewhere in the future is going to have a reason to stop the sequence. I think that's fine, that's true as far as it goes, but I think it should fundamentally be cold comfort for long-termists, because but for the Jam Tomorrow problem, they think, right, that it wouldn't be a bad thing if the planners of tomorrow were perfectly morally rational. It wouldn't be a bad thing if technology keeps improving and there are always opportunities to swap less for more. And it wouldn't be a bad thing if the future of sentient life continued forever. Indeed, these are exactly the sorts of things that long-termists strive for and try to bring about. And it seems very strange to me to say only conditional on these projects, which you could have imagine that Sam and Sasha's counterparts in other units in the Department of Long-Term Planning are all working on. Only conditional on their projects failing can they be saved from this worthless infinite deferral. And that doesn't seem any less paradoxical to me. So this gives me what I call the second version of the Jam Tomorrow problem. So one says, look, if I make a deferring trade-off, then I have to hope that it's not a member of an infinite series. For that to be true, it either has to be the case that future, so one of these things has to fail, future choosers are perfectly rational, or they don't get opportunities to trade less for more to make deferring trade-offs, or the future of sentient life doesn't continue, it fails to continue forever. Right, so that's premise one. So if I make a deferring trade-off, I have to hope these things are true. Premise two is it is rational to make deferring trade-offs, and premise three is none of these conditions are things that, but for the Jam Tomorrow paradox, would be good, or at least they wouldn't be bad. It wouldn't be bad if the future was indefinite and future planners were rational. And I think this sort of helps us to see why the paradox arises just on the condition of indefinite futures rather than it already being the case that it's infinite. So it's sort of in each case there's the hope, the possibility of there being a future generation and a generation after that. And if that can be brought about, then it seems like we should, but then we get the Jam Tomorrow paradox. And this is, I think, also particularly interesting because it was precisely the thought about the length of the future that seemed to justify long-termism and deferral in general. But now it shows that the more likely it is, if it turns out that happens forever, then the more likely that is to occur, the more likely it is that we shouldn't defer, right? But of course, the whole view is based on the idea of deferral. So I think there's a kind of weird contradiction here now in this marriage of long-termism and an act-utilitarian theory of objective reasons. So how could we resolve it? So it seems like so I've already kind of defended the thought that, at least on the face of it, we should accept that it's rational to make deferring trade-offs. We can maybe come back to that because, it leads to this paradox. It's very hard to see how we can resolve it, though, without saying that we can't make one-off deferring trade-offs. So I'm going to think about some other options. So maybe we could say, we could deny the claim that it's not bad for the future of sentient life to continue indefinitely. We could deny that it's morally rational to make trade-offs. I think I've kind of bracketed that. I think I've defended that, but we could talk about it. Or we could deny that it's not bad if future choosers are perfectly morally rational. So I'm going to talk about the first and third of those now. So you might be tempted by this third thought, right? It's not, maybe it isn't always okay if future choosers are perfectly rational. And maybe it's sometimes good if future choosers aren't perfectly morally rational. And I think one thing that might lead you to find this attractive is the literature on the kind of familiar literature in decision theory about paradoxes of infinite choice. So, for example, Artinius, Elgar, and Hawthorne have these great great discussions of like the Trump in hell paradox, which I think is great because that was written before Trump was who he is today. And you might think maybe we can just take the answers from decision theory and just adopt them here. But I think you can't, because I think it's not so straightforward to transpose a claim which is developed for a theory of ideal practical deliberation to a theory of objective moral reasons, because they're actually more different questions than you might think. Here's why I think that. So in cases where infinitely repeating a certain type of choice leads to disaster, leads to, in a sense, predictable and preventable disaster, Artinius, Elgar, and Hawthorne are willing to accept that each choice is rational. Why? So if each choice is rational, how can disaster be averted? Well, they say, look, it's rational to start a series of deferring choices, but it's also rational to self-bind, to like force your future self or your future counterpart to stop at some point in the future. And that's how you solve it. Right? So, it's rational every day of the week to exchange today's allocation of jam for more jam tomorrow. But, it's also rational for the White Queen on Monday to set things up, to force herself to eat the jam on Friday. So that's how they get out of, or that's at least one way of getting out of this problem in decision theory. But I don't think either of these claims is applicable in the story that I told you of Sam and Sasha. Because when Artinius, Elgar, and Hawthorne say that these individual choices are rational, they're talking about the kind of structural norms of decision theory. So, like on their view, these kind of Bayesian norms of rationality are so theoretically well supported that they're kind of willing to accept the outcome. That it just turns out that like a series of rational choices can lead to predictable and preventable disaster, right? Because they've got a different justification for the norms, right? And a way of kind of understanding what they're saying is like, it turns out that although this is the best structure of rational choice, it's not perfect. Maybe there is no perfect structure of rational choice that doesn't lead to some problems, but maybe that's okay because that's the goal of the theory, just to give you the best possible structure for like rational, like for strategic choice for kind of idealized agent. But this is supposed to be a claim about like objective moral reasons. And I think it's incoherent for a utilitarian to say that a series of morally rationally perfect, or like morally rationally required choices can predictably lead to preventable disaster, because the whole point of the theory was about bringing about good outcomes. Or another way of putting it, it might make sense to say there's no perfect decision theory But it's really weird to say your theory of what is objectively morally right is not perfect, because what is it then? Right? It's supposed to be a claim about what we ought to do, but now it's not perfect. Well, what kind of claim is it now? And indeed, self-binding might make sense in cases like, the Elsa case, Ulysses and the Sirens, where you predict that your preferences are going to sort of randomly change in the future, so you might bind your future self. But again, this story is nothing like that. The agents that Sam and Sasha in the future might attempt to bind in order to brave the series are rational moral planners just like them. Right? They haven't got different preferences, at least relevantly. Given this claim about agent neutrality, right, what's right for one to do is right for every identically placed agent to do, right? If you suppose, right, that Sam and Sasha, they take advice from the system theorists and say, look, what we're going to do is we're going to put something in place that will bind a future planner in like 200 years, let's call her Sabina, to cease accepting deferring trade-offs and cash in at this point. But if that's what they morally ought to do, then it would be the case that if they morally ought to bind Sabina and reasons are agent neutral, then it seems like Sabina morally ought to stop, because whatever I can force someone to do if reasons are agent neutral, they should do anyway. But there's no reason to think that Sabina ought to stop, so it can't be the case that they morally ought to bind her. And of course, binding is expensive, so it would be worse than people just doing what they ought to do, but it doesn't seem true that there's any agent they could bind who would have the reason anyway. So it doesn't seem that they could be doing the right thing and binding them. So, I don't think that we can appeal to the solution for the kind of familiar choices of infinite choice in decision theory to help us here, if it's a claim about objective moral reasons. So I think this brings us back to just the last option, right? About it not being bad for the future to continue, of sentient life to continue forever. Because, look, if that weren't true, then there's going to be some point in the future where we realize we're going to die at some point, let's eat all the jam. So that would solve the paradox, right? So can we accept that this would be an okay outcome? Or even maybe good? Well, look, long-termists are really focused on this question of preventing the extinction of sentient life. But utilitarian, at each point, long-termists are going to say, yeah, we have reason to strive for the continuation, at each point, we should continue sentient life, to the next points that we can affect. But strictly speaking, utilitarians don't have to accept that. There are some versions of utilitarianism, sort of more person-affecting versions that say, look, the goal isn't to make happy people, the goal is to make people happy. And so if it's true that there are going to be future people, then we should benefit them. But there's nothing intrinsically bad if life just popped out of existence. I mean, the process might be very bad, the apocalypse might be bad, but the fact that some future state of the world is just like barren rocks, that's just completely neutral. Right? I actually think that's fine. I don't dislike this. I think this might be the best solution for this paradox if you were committed to thinking this way. But it's really weird, I think, to accept, not just to think, okay, maybe it's fine, but to accept that it's good, or be kind of relieved that sentient life is going to end just in order to escape a paradox of morally rational choice, right? Because, anyone could cease the deferring chain. Anyone could cash in. They don't need that to be true. So why not just adopt a different moral theory rather than be like, oh, thank God we're going to get wiped out one day. That seems like a bizarre way to get to that conclusion. I don't think that this is a very appealing reason, but maybe that's fine. I think there's something kind of relieving about the thought that it's all going to end, and that we can stop being sort of rationally long-term and stop planning for the future. In one's own life, you might think the fact that I'm going to die at some point kind of relieves me of the burden of prudence. I don't have to keep planning for my future. Somewhere to get to just have a good time. But this option isn't even available to total utilitarians. So total utilitarianism is the view that what really matters is not benefiting people if they happen to exist, but it's actually good that there are happy beings. So the goal is to make happy people. That is a good thing. Adding a happy person to the world always makes it better. I think they can't take this solution, and I think they get to an even worse problem. So I'm just going to give a final story. So Anusha was another colleague in the Department for Long-Term Planning. She worked in the much more exciting and glamorous existential risk division, trying to work out things that could cause sentient life to be wiped out and reduce the probability of them happening. And Anusha is a total utilitarian. She's inspired by this observation, this claim that Derek Parfit made, which is, you might think intuitively, so here's one comparison. No one gets wiped out, or a disaster occurs that wipes out 99.9% of life on Earth. Right? Here's another comparison. A disaster that wipes out 99.9% of life on Earth and one that wipes out 100% of life on Earth. And Derek Parfit said that the gap between the second and third is much bigger than the gap between the first and second, because if at least some sentient life survives, then those sort of few, a second Adam and Eve, can repopulate the Earth. And over the course of the long durée, the billions upon billions upon billions of ancestors, would mean that the near extinction of life now was a comparative blip, compared to the dwarfed by the numbers of those who will come about in the future. And so she took this seriously, and this was what she was working to do anything that might slightly reduce that chance of total sentient extinction. And she was lucky. She was well placed to do this. She was in the department for it. But in another sense, Anusha was very unlucky, because she was just one of these people who initially got into altruism, wanting to help people face to face and be around people. The work she was doing in the department of sitting there with spreadsheets in the office, working long hours, she hated it. She found it completely for herself valueless. She hated her life. She would rather die than live a life condemned to always working in this way. But she reasoned that one woman's unhappiness was comparatively irrelevant compared to even the tiniest probability of preventing sentient life from being wiped out. And so she persevered in her work, despite the fact that she, for her own sake, detested it. But after talking to Sam and Sasha, she realized that there was another paradox that faced her, because after all, she wasn't that special, right? Anyone might lead a life that was worse than death for them in order to reduce the probability of sentient life being extinguished. And if they could do that, they should do that. And nothing guaranteed that future people weren't all in the situation. They could all sacrifice their own interests to make the tiniest chance of life going extinct. But of course, maybe they wouldn't do it, but it seems like they should do it morally, right? But if they did do that, then again, no one would ever have a life worth living. In fact, this would fill the future with misery. But if it filled the future with misery, then surely it would be worse than sentient life going extinct. So I've called this the new repugnant conclusion, because I think it's an even worse outcome than the standard repugnant conclusion, which fills the world with people whose lives are only just worth living. You could bite the bullet and think that's okay. You can't possibly think that this is an okay outcome. Now, of course, this might be quite fanciful too, right? Because I'm assuming that there are people who hate, so Anusha hates her work so much that she'd rather die than do it. Some people do enjoy doing long-termist work. I was at the Global Priorities Institute yesterday. It's full of long-termists. They seem to be having a kind of good time, right? So as long as some people are enjoying the work, then if everyone does what they morally ought to do, then there is some positive utility to it, right? As long as enough people enjoy it. So maybe it's fine, right? But notice that this requires a convergence of self-interest and moral requirement. And this was a thing that kind of worried Henry Sidgwick a lot in what he called the dualism of practical reason. But since Sidgwick, most utilitarians have thought, no, we don't have to assume these things align. They can go in totally different directions, and morality always trumps. Morality always trumps self-interest. But now we've got the conclusion that unless doing what you're morally required to do and doing what benefits you align, then we get another version of the paradox. So now we do need, for very principled reasons, to think that there is just such an alignment, which most utilitarians have rejected. So I don't really know what to think about this. I kind of I'm very compelled by the axiological claim that the interests of people in the far future are just as important as the interests of those who live today. And I'm also very compelled by the thought that endless deferring is worthless, that you shouldn't always try and get the option of more time tomorrow and less time today. That's clearly worthless. We can't always sacrifice the now for the next. But I don't know if there's any kind of rule, any way for a basically act-utilitarian theory of objective moral reasons to avoid this. And I don't know what kind of non-ad hoc principle, not a principle of decision-making, right, but a principle about what we objectively ought to do can avoid this conclusion without much more radical changes to the moral theory. But I'm, and I certainly think that you couldn't possibly be any kind of totalist. There'd be no way of doing that. So I'm kind of looking for solutions. How do you solve it? But I don't know the answer. Thank you.